Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm Desiree Schell. After 233 episodes, we want to make an announcement. We're changing our name to Science for the People. In the last almost 5 years, we've changed a lot. We started out on a little radio station called CJSR in Edmonton, a station that we still get delightfully fuzzy feelings about calling our home. We were a bit of a niche program, looking at issues from a fairly narrow perspective, and we saw ourselves as serving the skeptical community. Back then it was live, with a host, me, a guy operating the boards, and a guy answering the phones. And our team has changed a lot since then, adding more hosts and more team members, and we became, well, pretty slick for an operation that ain't nobody get paid for. With the changes in production came a parallel change in the content direction. Fairly early on, we started broadening ourselves, and it became less about this skepticism thing and more about science and how cool it is and how it's still so relevant to people who can't tell a gluon from a quark. If we were going to have someone on the show that most people had never heard of before, well, they might as well have written a book called Sex, Genes, and Rock and Roll, or about how female bonobos say hello by rubbing clitorises, or someone who actually worked on Mars lander projects, or someone who asked the scientific question about why some people aren't straight. And a funny thing happened when we started doing this. The authors and the experts said yes. They came on the show, and we let them talk about their work, beyond the sound bites that they might be allowed if they were lucky in most other places. And while we're aware and thankful for all the science geeks who tuned in, we kept asking ourselves, why should someone who doesn't know a thing about science care about this topic? And that really became our philosophy. And people really seemed to like it. You guys, out there in audience land. And we are so thankful for it. Really, thank you. We dropped our niche target audience long ago in the pursuit of something offering a little slice of science to the people who throw on their community radio station while they're driving to work, or painting some protest signs, or just dancing naked in the shower. We want to get the word out about something that we love to people who might not hear about it anywhere else, in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, they'll love it a little too. We're about taking tough scientific concepts and teasing out what matters. We take the latest in scientific progress and relate it to people like our friends and our families, and our communities, and our society. We're about getting fascinating guests on air and giving them the time to talk, something that they don't get anywhere else. We're the child who asked their parents, "Why is that?" and didn't settle for the first answer. We want listeners to say, well, that's interesting. We're Science for the People, and we can't wait to move forward with all of you as we seek to make ourselves that much more accessible and inclusive. From an audience standpoint, not much will change. We enjoy our format, and we hope that you do too. But along with the new name, we do have a new website and a fancy new logo. The new site can be found at scienceforthepeople.ca, and it'll include all of our past episodes in their original formats. So, welcome to Science for the People. Thanks again for your continued support of our team of misfits who didn't accept because as an answer. In the spirit of change, we are going to go off format. We thought that some of you might be interested in the thought processes behind the name change, so I have with me today all the hosts of the radio show previously known as Skeptically Speaking. Hello, Marie-Claire Shanahan.
Hi, Desiree.
And hello, Rachelle Saunders, who is also the producer of the program.
Hi.
So let's start out by saying that we have been talking about a name change for a long time now. So from your own perspectives, why did you guys feel like we needed one?
For me, it was really about the way I think the show has changed over how long have we been on the air? 3 years? Something like that? 5 years?
Almost 4, I think. I love that we did not check that.
Yeah. it started out as a really kind of nichely targeted show for a single community. The show kind of grew from that, so those sort of humble roots, and we really expanded into different topic areas. And I mean, science is really at the heart of the show, and it really is sort of what the show is about at its core. But it's also about how science interconnects with real life and everybody's life, not just if you're a researcher, but also if you're just sort of a person living and everything you do. And I think the name change is reflective of that. I also think that there's probably not a lot of people who know what the term skeptic means. So it's a little bit more sort of obvious what's in the tin if you've never listened to us before.
Yeah, and me being sort of a newer addition to the show, I kind of came into it and, wanting to learn about what it was about and what kind of topics, you guys were interested in and what kind of things we should be doing on the show. I sort of remember thinking, oh, that sounds different than what I might have expected. And I think the new name really reflects what I learned from both in terms of talking to you about why you do the show and what it means to you and why do a science show like this. The answers that I always got and what I started to see when I listened to the show was exactly about that. It was about not science just because it's cool. It is cool, but science because it's something really important that can be useful to a lot of people. If we can be sharing that, if we can be providing it in a way that people can take that and use it in their everyday lives, then I think we're doing something really valuable. And that's the impression I got from you when I was learning about the show. And now I think the name is something, the new name really reflects that.
Well, I think you both touched on something there, sort of what skepticism actually means. And I do think that not a lot of people know what it means, and so it's unnecessarily confusing sometimes. And also the fact that skepticism has a definition, and it has a fairly narrow definition, and it's definitely in dispute as to whether that word should include examinations of things like culture and social issues and politics, things that aren't exactly based on empiricism. That's very much a fair argument to have. But those are the things I find really interesting. And so, MC, that's kind of your field, is it not?
Yeah, it sort of is. I mean, for me, that's the part of science I do is how do people learn about it? How do they connect to it? How do they decide it's something that they can really use? How does it sometimes exclude people? All of those social questions, that's what I've always been most passionate about in science, is wanting to answer those things. And I know that's different than studying science. It is actually a different thing. But I think those questions are actually really important. Science communication and talking to people about science has to be about a lot more than I'm going to tell you something and you are going to understand it. And that's the end of the story.
There's always been a certain amount of science itself, we have some really hardcore physics, let's just talk about science kind of shows. But I think where we really shine as a show and where nobody else is really doing what we're doing is when we really kind of talk about science and talk about how it crosses over into other things, politics, gender, just culture stuff, and how you can either use it to understand your own world better, or how it's being potentially misused, or how it's being misinterpreted, or how it's being explained badly. And I really love that we do long format stuff here. So we let researchers and science journalists and scientists actually sort of talk entirely about their research rather than kind of restricting them to a little soundbite.
Well, and that's one of the things that, science isn't perfect, but it is definitely the best way to figure out what does and doesn't work. And something that I find really interesting in basically every area of my life is how public policy fits in. So I want to know that the decisions that politicians make are based on evidence, not ideology, and we get to touch on some of that within the show.
Yeah, I think that's another really, really important part of it. I always kind of, as you said, it's sort of what I do, and I tend to look at things through the eyes of the individual who's going to be able to take and hear these things. But obviously, the other side of that is, we're all affected by policies like that as well, and it's really important that we spend time questioning how science is used for public policy and whether it's really being used to its best effect, I guess, is what we're after. Is it really being used in a way that's useful rather than either being pushed aside or cherry picked or or, used in manipulative sort of ways.
Or whether it's being ignored entirely.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Oh, there's that. The title itself, Science for the People, that really resonated with me, partially because of the group from the 70s of the same name. And we will have Alice Bell on later to talk about the original group, Science for the People. They were radical science folk that didn't think that science should be neutral on political issues. So what do you guys think about that?
I don't know necessarily that science should be sort of science as an as an ideology or as an idea should take a side on political issues, but I certainly think that science should be leveraged when, like you guys said before, when deciding on things of public policy. And nobody should be shy about saying, well, this is something we can test. We don't just have to shoot from the hip here. We can actually look at data and analyze that data based on current scientific understanding and really get a better idea of how maybe this could work or maybe it should work better, rather than just sort of, using, everyone sort of thinks, well, I obviously know how this works because common sense. But a lot of times common sense just goes the wrong way, and something that seems like it should be obvious is often completely contrary to your expectations.
So the other side of that, one thing is that, science shouldn't be silent on political issues because it has a lot to offer to them. But the other side of it is that science itself isn't apolitical. And I don't mean that as any kind of radical critique of science. It's obviously an empirical endeavor that, is based on evidence and seeking out kind of our best possible understanding. But there are elements of that are political in terms of what gets studied, how it gets studied, what gets funded. All of those things are political. So the other side of that is people have to be involved in questioning that. People have to be involved in making sure that the things that are getting studied, the way those studies are being applied, that's actually the way that we as people, as human beings, want it to be. That the focus is where we think it should be.
If we don't actually take those things into account when we're talking about these kinds of issues, we're not actually fully using what the scientific method gives us.
Yeah, I think so too. We're missing out on possible values that it can offer.
Or we're scaring ourselves silly for no real reason.
That too.
One of the other things, sort of stepping away from politics for a second, is I love the fact that we do science history on the show. That makes me so happy because there's so much rich backstory and interesting people who have come before. There's a ton of interesting people working in the field now and a lot of current stories to tell. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff that already happened that a lot of people don't know and don't sort of know the stories behind, which I think is just fantastic.
Those have been some of my very favorite episodes to host. I've loved reading about, Newton and the Counterfeiter. That one was a real favorite of mine, as well as talking about Alexander Agassiz. Really a character who is sometimes just a footnote as the son of, and really that he had his own story. I think we're really lucky to get the chance to share those stories more widely.
So we've talked about all the reasons that we felt like it was time to change the name. But it was really hard to find a new name.
It was. I know we've certainly been thinking about it and sort of talking about it for a while. And it's hard to find something that resonates, that isn't sort of playing on something that already exists. Or it was tough. But when we did find one, we were sort of like, yeah, we like that. That seems about right for us. That's good.
Yeah, in the end, it happened actually really fast. Was sort of lots of talking about trying to find something, and then when we came up with the idea we did, it seemed to go suddenly like, oh yeah, that's perfect, that's great.
Science for the people. I really need to make it very obvious that it's the people part that I like so much, because I think that's something that we really focus on the show, is making science accessible to people and having people, real live people, understand how science affects them on a day-to-day basis, and also that science does not only exist in a lab, it exists out in the world, and it is sometimes very interesting.
Most of the time, actually, very interesting. And I love that we managed to get so many actual scientists and researchers on the show to talk about their work. And I think it's great partly because a lot of people say that scientists are intimidating and mathematicians are intimidating to talk to. And certainly, I've felt that before, but not since I started working on the show, because you end up talking to so many of them and they're just so excited all the time to talk about what they're working on. And most of them are really, really good at talking about their work in a way that isn't, talking to you like you're a child, but is also really accessible. And I think it also helps that as hosts, at least, Desiree and I, we don't have a background in any kind of hard science. We are lay people who just love learning, and we're there to go, wait, what? And we're also there to make happy, excited noises when things go great.
You're talking about me, aren't you?
I sure am.
Yeah. Let's talk about something that happened earlier today. I sent both of you an email about Popular Science turning off their comments section. So maybe, MC, can you give us just a bit of background there?
What they were saying is they were turning off their comments, and the big reason they gave is that incivility in the comments was really poisoning people's perceptions of what they were reading on Popular Science. So everyone's had that experience of reading something, an interesting article, and then you look at the comments and you sort of lose all faith in humanity.
I admit I do have a don't ever read the comments policy in my personal life.
No.
Right. But despite that sort of that feeling that lots of us have, there's actually a lot of value to comments. And one of the things they sort of cited some work looking at how incivility might influence people's perceptions of what they're reading, like whether they might be more or less supportive of scientific either information, or they were talking about technological innovation based on the civility of the comments. And I kind of dug back into it and found that the impact actually really wasn't that big. The biggest thing, and this is something that I would have told you yesterday too, or the day before, the biggest thing that influences how people perceive things is what they already thought when they came. And I think we know that, and that actually had very little to do with the civility. So the evidence for saying that the tone of comments really has a bad impact on people's perceptions of science doesn't really seem to be there. There seems to be more reaction to that anecdotal feeling of people say really horrible things sometimes in comments, which is true. But the second piece of it is, I think this is really overreactionary. Basically, we're losing all the benefit of comments instead of just trying to remove the things that we find objectionable about them. And I think that actually, as I said when I responded to your email, actually has a lot to do with the show. We talk a lot about wanting people to be more engaged with science, to take more of an interest, to be part of scientific discussions, to really use scientific information in their everyday lives. And one of the few places that people can actually engage, and by engage I don't mean just listen, I mean actually ask questions, challenge people, get to participate and contribute to a scientific discussion. That's not something that most people get a chance to do every day. And comment spaces are actually one of the really few places to do that, and probably one of the most accessible places to do that. So by deciding that because of incivility, which could probably be dealt with in other ways, because of that, if we're going to turn off comment section, what we're really doing is taking away people's opportunity to engage. We're really stopping the dialogue and going back to a model of science communication that's about saying, here's this amazing thing, you should listen to it and believe it and walk away. And that's it.
That doesn't sound like science.
No, it isn't, exactly. Really, science is about discussion. Science is about questioning. Science is about asking for evidence and challenging ideas. And a model of communication that says, no, actually, we don't want you to do that. It's not actually very scientific, but it also, the people who are most affected by that are the people, in a sense. And I especially mean people who largely live outside of sort of professional scientific communities.
Well, you sounded a lot more calm than you did in the email when I when I asked, is this something that we should think about? And I think that's the first time I've ever read a curse word by you.
Yeah, I was sort of angry when I first read that. I've written a blog post. I've gotten most of it out. I'm going to post that tomorrow. So I feel much more calm about the whole situation.
But I think that this is something that that is really important to us, as you said. I think we all genuinely want to do effective, accessible science communication. We want people to engage. even if they're in absolute disagreement.
Yeah, I think so. And I think especially because we talk about social issues and the implications of science, those in particular are the places where we should be having discussion and disagreement sometimes too.
I think a willingness to engage, even if your understanding is flawed or your information is incorrect or you have contrary beliefs behind you driving your engagement. I think the willingness to engage is a hugely important first step because, I mean, there's so many people who are just willing to sort of not even bother. And if you're reading and listening and then saying something back, I think that's incredibly valuable. And it's also the sign that it's a good sign that somebody wants to learn more, somebody's interested, or somebody is keen, I guess. And obviously with comments, there's always going to be troll issues, and there's horrible people out there who will take any public space they can in order to say and do horrible things. And I don't like to let the trolls get you down. So.
And I am not at all trying to argue that there are not horrible comments out there, and that we shouldn't look for things to change those conversations and find ways to, weed out the comments like that from the ones that are really valuable. But I think the general idea, and it's something that I think we hold kind of dear on the show, that I wish more people would sort of take into the way that they think about science communication and sharing scientific information, is that it is a conversation. It is a place for people to engage and change their minds and take things and understand them in ways that are useful and of benefit to them, not just, as I said, take this, listen, and walk away.
Well, and I need to actually thank everyone in the audience because when we receive emails to correct us or are somehow critical, I know what happens out there on the internet, and I know what kind of responses a lot of people I know receive. But even the negative emails that we get start with, "I really, really love your show, but..." And I accept that. Thank you very much, everybody.
For anybody listening out there, if you are interested in sending us a question, or if you have an idea for something that you want to know more about, we sit together and think up interesting ideas for shows, or watch the news and come up with, decide to do something on some recent piece of science news, or read an interesting science book and do a show on that. But if you have something that you want to know more about and we haven't done it yet, send us your ideas. That would be amazing. We love to get listener ideas. And we quite often act upon them as well. So sometimes it takes us a little while to find a good guest or to find a person who's really knowledgeable so we can do the topic justice. But I think we've done a lot of suggested topics.
Well, and let's be clear, we do have a new name, but ultimately the format for this show will not change very much, if at all, because we love talking about the intersection of science and history, and science and art, and science and public policy, and science and politics, and science and science and science. Just science.
I was just going to say, and sometimes there's going to be a sprinkling of straight up science in there, which we've always loved. Maybe more than a sprinkling, maybe a healthy dollop. I think ultimately changing the name to Science for the People is much more true to what the show is and what the show has become and what we all want the show to be. And also, I think it really allows us to reach more people. I think the show will continue to grow. And I think that using something that is a term like Science for the People, which is both friendly and really clear about what the heart of the show is, will help people love us even more.
And actually, one thing we didn't mention, we do have a tagline for the show. It's Science for the People, putting science in context. And that was actually Marie Claire's idea. Do you want to just maybe put that in context, as it were?
So I think what I was just trying to do is sort of explain what we did. I wasn't sort of thinking of it as a tagline for the show. What I was thinking when I said it was, we're not so much just a show about saying, here's this new piece of research and this is what it is. I think when you look at it, at the topics that we choose, we're a lot more, even when we do that, we're a lot more about why is this interesting? Why is it important? Why do we want to spend an hour talking about this? And usually it's because it's really meaningful. It puts something in historical perspective. It really changes the way we might think about something. The sort of whole point of, I think, what we do isn't just telling people scientific information. It's helping share why it's exciting, why it's important, why it's valuable, and giving it, that's kind of the context I think I had in mind when I said it.
I also really like that we have taken the time to talk about some studies that have hit mainstream media that have been seriously flawed, and that we have talked about how some of these studies are seriously flawed, and what some of the problems with them are, and how sometimes this stuff can get really inflated artificially in a lot of your sort of typical media when you're flipping through the newspaper, when you're watching your Facebook feed. And I love that sometimes we take the time to actually say, okay, there's this study out there that everybody's talking about. What's up with that? And sometimes what's up with that is like everybody's interpreting this really badly, or someone made a huge leap when they should have taken a tiny step. And I really like that we take the time to talk about the challenges, and also some of the, I guess the best word I can think of, and maybe it's not appropriate, is the nonsense that goes on sometimes in science reporting.
No, I absolutely agree. I actually use the show as backup in my own personal conversations. I have become that annoying person that someone will say something that is mildly outlandish, let's say. And I can say, oh, that's really interesting because I did a show on that.
On that sort of topic as well, I also think it's really awesome that we continue to talk about speculative science and really interesting speculative stuff, but that we're really good about saying, okay, now we're speculating, and there's a lot of what ifing going on here, and there's only so much accuracy we can be, but we're sort of having fun. But I like that we both allow ourselves to do that because it's a lot of fun and sometimes it's really interesting, but that we also do what a lot of people don't do, which is say we're speculating. And I think that's great.
I don't want anything to be off limits with this show. If it is barely related to science and it's something that me or you or MC find interesting, I want to be able to take that on because I know that there are other people out there who have the same interests as we do, and maybe they don't know it yet.
I agree wholeheartedly.
So on that note, thank you guys for being here. This was lovely. I don't think we've ever had the chance to do this before.
I think this is the first time all three of us have been on air at the same time.
I think it definitely is, and it's been a pleasure.
And one more thank you. Thanks very much to you, our audience, for all your support over the years, and for listening to Skeptically Speaking. And we hope that you continue to listen to Science for the People. Right after the break, we'll be back to talk about the radical science movement of the 1970s with Guardian writer Alice Bell. Stay tuned.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and I'm very happy to have Alice Bell with us today. Alice is a research fellow and head of public engagement at the Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex. She's also a science blogger for The Guardian, columnist for Popular Science UK, and co-editor at New Left Project. She was previously lecturer in science communication at Imperial College, where she also completed a PhD in children's science media. She recently wrote a piece for The Guardian that I loved, titled Beneath the White Coat, the Radical Science Movement. Welcome to the show, Alice.
Hello.
So what got you interested in researching radical science in the first place?
I didn't really come to it. It came to me. I was just sitting at my desk one day and one of my colleagues rang up and said, I'm clearing out this old library. The department I work in has been running about 50 years. We've got quite a rich library of collections of things that people have picked up on the relationship between science and politics. And they were just clearing an old one out. And one of my colleagues rang me up and said, "Oh, I've just got all these magazines that are spare and they're going to go in the bin, but I thought you might want to look at them first." So they're called Science and People. And I thought, okay, well, I like people and I like science and I like scientists talking to people. So I thought it might be just something about sort of from the public understanding of science movement, slightly kind of the sort of stuff that I'm quite used to seeing, which is scientists saying that the public must listen to us more. The people must understand science more. I thought, well, I'll have a look at it anyway. And so he came and he dumped all these magazines on my desk, and there were quite a lot of them. There was about 4 or 5 different types of title. They weren't all just science for people. And I was amazed. They were brilliant. I was completely taken in by them. They were like nothing I had really seen or expected to see like that before. I knew some of the writers, I knew a lot of the ideas, but I'd never realised that they'd collected together as a community like that to publish, or been quite so explicit about their politics. And I've just spent the last few months completely down the rabbit hole of them all, just reading the different things they had to say, the different arguments they've had, their pictures, their artwork. And so, yeah, it found me rather than me seeking it out, really.
Well, maybe give us some background about this group, or these groups, I should say.
The main group that I have a collection on is Science for People, but they were part of probably several different strands of what we might call broadly the radical science movement of the 1970s. There's a long history of politically engaged scientists, people drawn to do science through a commitment to social change and desire to solve the world's problems, but also increasingly through the 20th century, particularly post-war, you see scientists very aware that their work might be applied to ends that they don't feel particularly comfortable with, particularly after the Manhattan Project. And so you see scientists are thinking about where they put their energies and wanting to be reflective about that. You have a rise of people talking about the social responsibility of the scientist. And there's also quite a long-standing relationship between some areas of left-wing politics and science technology, sort of overlapping religions, I suppose, to do with social change. And in the UK, although he had a lot of international impact, there was a guy called J.D. Burnell who wrote a very influential book in the 30s about the social structures of science and how we could manage them to use scientific energy to sort of help to solve the great world's problems, great challenges. And the idea that science can solve global challenges is quite a mainstream one, but it was one that was associated with some areas of left-wing politics. And the radical science movement were part of that. They kind of came back to this earlier thing that you'd had from Burnell in the 30s, but took a slightly different spin on it. It was one that was much more associated with the politics of the new left and a sort of post-war approach to these things. With respect to science, there was a real reflection of the peace movement and a kind of humble attitude. I think if you see the stuff pre-war, it's all science can save the world, we're brilliant, everyone just must do what we want. With the later stuff, you've got more of a kind of, well, maybe we should change ourselves, maybe we're part of the problem. And they were influenced, it's partly the impact of the war, but I think also an influence of the feminist movement as that grew as well, a sense that the sort of status quo as it is might be the problem and it needs to change itself. And so that's sort of where they came from politically, and they were associated with various different groups and had different strands or approaches depending on sort of where they were geographically or politically. So in the UK, we had one that came out very much from the scientific establishment and was a bit looser ideologically speaking. It wasn't just straightforwardly left-wing, although it became quite much more left-wing and had lots of fights about being not left-wing enough. In America, you had Science for the People, who were quite explicitly aligned with politically the hard left. I've got a beautiful cover of one of them which has a picture of Lenin and Marx in lab coat doing science. And the logos for both the main British science group, Science for People, and the American magazine Science for the People, they both shared the same logo, which was a kind of stiffness on the clarity next to a lab flask, kind of connecting the two together. But there were also other smaller groups around that. There were alternative technology things like Undercurrent as a magazine. There was the Radical Statistics Society, found some radical nursing groups as well. And they all had their own allegiances and interests depending on where they were, either in terms of professional groups like nursing or statisticians, or also slightly different ideological standpoints or interests to that. But in the UK, they were particularly associated with CND, I think, as well, and the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely, and I'm thrilled. And there were some high-profile people involved, were there not?
So the UK one, certainly, it came out of the British Society for Social Responsibility and Science, or BSRS, as it got called, which was started by Maurice Wilkins and a lot of big names at the Royal Society. There's this lovely story of when they had their first meeting at the Royal Society, and they had several hundred people turn up. They were amazed, they didn't think anyone was going to come, and they weren't all science either, and someone stood up from the lecture floor and went, this is great. We don't normally have meetings like this where the public just ordinary members of the public come into Royal Society. And someone else sitting next to her stood up and went, oh, well, it's all right, because ordinary scientists don't normally come to the Royal Society either. But still on the stage, the people who there were lots of diverse people in attending at that meeting, but on the stage it was the big names like Maurice Wilkins. And there was another story from that meeting was that somebody said, it's such a shame that one of our great leaders who sort of set up this whole movement in the 30s was too ill to be here, and then there's this sort of noise from the back and they're told that actually J.D. Burnell is still there, he's just being a bit quiet because he's a bit ill. So there were the big names like that, J.B.S. Haldane, people like that were associated with it. But gradually it got, they were very aware as a group. They organised through sort of local meetings in pubs and local meetings in different universities and different towns. So you see the early newsletters that have adverts saying, I want to set one up in Brighton, or I want to set one up in Liverpool. And they were a network of different groups that met together and collectivised, and they had that sort of system for running. And as a result, I think they sort of had a bit of a grassroots takeover as a consequence. They were quite committed to ideas of critiquing the hierarchies of science. In fact, one group that were associated with them actually set up a whole laboratory based on horizontal power structures opposed to the vertical ones, which we still, I think it's fair to say that science technology has always been quite the academic sciences heavily dominated by, and wanted to buck that trend. And so as a movement themselves within Desiree, there were lots of people trying to carry that. And as a result, eventually by the early 80s, late 70s and early 80s, you see references to this in the magazine, where as their editorial board shifts and changes, you'll see them say, well, we're going to move away from just what the scientists want to talk to the public about, and what is it actually that everyday people who use science want to talk about. This doesn't necessarily mean they're the public. There was a real focus on industrial scientists, and there was a big involvement in the trade union movement. And probably one of the biggest outcomes of that group in the UK was strengthening of awareness and policies around hazards at work. So it was a real sort of the shop floor scientist, which is very different from the big names who get Nobel Prizes or write for Nature or something.
Well, and they, in addition to the radical politics that they wrote about, and I flipped through some of those, and actually maybe give us an example of some of the articles that they would have written, because some of the titles are spectacular.
Well, in the UK, some of them started off a bit where they were just having spats with each other, and you can see why there was this frustration out, possibly that it's all just what the elite scientists think and want to talk to about each other. So you have sort of examples of them trying to argue at the big science festivals, or they had this big long-standing spat with the editor of Nature, the editor of Nature had to fight with all sorts of people. So there was a sort of, I guess, a sense of attention to, they paid a lot of attention to what the elite was getting up to, and the sort of internal scientific gossip. And later then you would get things where they'd explicitly say that they move away from just sort of what are scientists talking about, and more looking at big social issues. And one of the things I really liked about it, that really drew me in when I first came across them, was that they weren't just what I think I personally find a lot of the stuff about science and society this today is, so what is it that scientists are interested in? Why aren't the public interested in this too? Why aren't the public interested in the strange admin system that we have? I don't really care about that. What is it that scientists are doing about CS gas or something? So they had a big campaign on CS gas and the use of chemical warfare, particularly just like the things that were happening in the streets in Northern Ireland. There were people who were really attached to that policing. They wrote a whole book on the technologies of political control, and the ways in which different forms of science and technology might, including social science and statistics and management structures, might be used for policing society. There's a beautiful cartoon in one of them, I thought, which is a sort of cartoon of a policeman, which is Janus face, two sides of the police person, which I think was sort of reflecting a sense of Janus face of technology as being applicable in lots of different ways. They did a lot on pollution, but it wasn't the sort of normal thing you see about pollution. It wasn't just what you were seeing then increasingly more stories about water pollution or air pollution, but it was a workers' issue, and that people who were working in various industries were most likely to be at the forefront of negative effects of pollution, and how they might spot the pollution at work and do something about it and learn about it and change things. They also talked quite a bit about energy. The things that you see there, it's almost identical to energy stories we have today, even though the politics around it is quite different. There were still some sort of central issues that came up in central fight, particularly around the late 70s when there were quite a bit of an energy crisis in the UK. And a sense also, I guess when I said that they weren't too interested in the internal politics of science later on, they did still keep an interest in how science was funded. And there are reflection upon how much money from the drug industry and the oil industry and the military go into it. They had quite an interesting number of articles about the oil industry, because in many ways, even if I talk to the people who've done some more work on the history of anti-oil activism, they say it's not something that really kicked off until later in the 20th century. It is relatively early, because not really starting to think about climate change at this point. Even in the later articles in the 80s, it's not really at the forefront. That's not the way in which we now see anti-oil activism. This was much more about direct pollution, and also very much about the effect people who work at somewhere like the people who work on oil rigs were maybe not treated as well as they could be, or are endangering themselves.
Well, and so much of their writing was focused on workers. So what did the public think of their work? Did they know it was around? Did it make it out there?
Well, I don't know if it did have a huge public impact in the same way, although it was a real sense of science for people and the people. I don't think it had the same kind of public outreach orientation that you'd see in something like the Public Understanding of Science movement, which maybe took over from the mid-80s onwards, which was much more about talking to the public as a whole. These were still talking to scientists or people who worked in science technology. They just didn't look at the big names. It wasn't about serving the fellows of the Royal Society. It was more about people who use and do science technology on an everyday level. Although they maybe had more, there was also things with activist groups. So they did quite a lot of work on things to do with rubber bullets, and they actually had an exhibition in Brookshire, where I live in South London, which they did with anti-militarisation groups about the use of rubber bullets. And so that was just taking what their understandings and their expertise into another field outside of science technology. But it wasn't talking to the public as a whole in that kind of general. Well, I've got a colleague who talks about publics in particular rather than publics in general. This was sort of a non-scientific group, a group that wouldn't identify as being part of science, but not everybody who watches a particular the BBC or something.
Right.
It was seeing public in a different way. So, and they also did a lot with feminism. So some of the stuff they did on feminism, they had a whole edition of one of the magazines of the British One Science of People that was written by the Women's Co-op, which was an anonymous cooperative editorial board of all women, as opposed to having sort of named authors and a real structure that they generally had. And that drew out a lot of issues to do with being a scientist and who's a woman, so things like sexism in the lab and stuff. But they also did quite a lot on the impact of various science and technologies on women, so a lot on reproductive stuff, on the pill. Apparently, they also had, I said they had networks where they organised, they also had sort of semi-public events they used to have a group called Beneath the White Coat, which were like little seminars that would meet in pubs. It's a bit like the Skeptics and the Pub movement, which is something that's grown up in the UK in the last few years and started to travel around the world. But they sort of meet in pubs, and a couple of people would speak and they'd have a bit of an argument. And apparently people still aren't speaking to each other because of some Beneath the White Coat discussion on the pill that they had in the early 80s. So I have started to kind of talk to people who are involved in it. What I'd ideally like to do eventually is build an oral history of people who are involved. And I was speaking to one of them who said that they were very emotional, and they were emotional about their science and about what science could be for the world in a way that we don't always have today. But for that reason, it was one of the reasons why they all fell out, was that they had a lot of arguments, and that sustained them. It gave them a lot of energy and interesting points, and it certainly generated a lot of very exciting and interesting content. And you can see those fights within the letters pages within themselves. It wasn't just that they were fighting with nature and stuff. They were fighting within themselves quite badly, or quite interestingly and productively equally. But eventually, that was one of the reasons why they fell apart, which may be sad, but also maybe inevitable.
Well, do you think a group like this could exist now? Because as you said, the problems that we're facing now are very similar.
It was interesting the number of people who have not just, after I wrote a piece about it for The Guardian, and I also had been just posting on Twitter as I did. I had to say, well, I had normal work to get on with, but I had this kind of beautiful magazine that I wanted to play with. So every now and again I give myself sort of half an hour off going to read these things rather than doing my main work. That kind of like, it's my lunch break thing. And I'd post some of them on Twitter, and I posted one piece, one cover of a snippet from Undercurrents, which is the alternative technology magazine, or just on Facebook, and somebody then emailed me and go, can we redo this picture to the cover of our magazine? So the cover of the latest Red Pepper magazine is actually inspired by something I just shared on Facebook, because I just finished work for the day and was reading through some of my old magazines for some fun. But yes, lots of people have got in touch with me, not just because they want to use the images because they're pretty, but have said, do you think we could organise this? And I'm not sure I've seen enough people agreeing on the terms or having enough commitment to actually organise something. The sort of thing people go, we quite like something like that today, but whether you can can then make the step to do it, I'm not sure. And I think one of the reasons why it might stop us from doing it, forming something like that, be that there's lots of smaller interactions. We don't need to collect together, print a magazine, or have a formal membership body to interact like that. People do it on an everyday level quite easily on something like Twitter or through blogging. However, that may maybe lose the same sort of identity of signing up to something because of that negative thing, that we have so much, lots of everyday bit. We don't then do something a bit more drastic. It would be interesting to see. I don't know what they call themselves, whether they'd have the Sign for People system that you had with the American magazine group, which was very explicitly radically left. And I wonder if the relationship between the hard left and science technology is in a state now in a way that could come to being, maybe. It might be interesting to see. I know there are certainly some people who'd like to heal any kind of defies OR and ultimately say that the idea that the left has a science problem is a bit overstated and is not necessarily true. But then the sort of system, the sort of project that they started in the UK, the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science, I think it was quite pompous in its setup to start off with, and I don't know if people would want it to. I know some activist groups in the UK who want to work on specific issues more and more with science technology, and the environmentalist movement already does quite a bit, and I think they're having increasing interest in the politics of how science is done, which is something that the Science of People movement really did, is that they were interested in that funding and the politics of doing science, not just the impact of it. I'm increasingly finding that people are interested in that and ask me about that. And you know, some groups that want to organise around some of those things. Corporate sponsorship of science and science communication, for example, is an issue, and the lobbying of scientists. Somebody emailed me last week about the public funding of research into fracking and why they have that. Or similarly, I was talking this morning about how there is a Statoil-sponsored chair in geology at the University of Durham. So the political consequences in that, and making people aware of that, that might be something that you might see a group coming together on. I don't know. I do wonder if, because we can talk so much on an everyday level about these things, whether we could kind of get that movement. And also the question of whether science as a whole has become much more right-wing orientated or less politically engaged. I know that Hilary Rose, who was one of the members of the radical science movement in the 70s and 80s, is writing a book on it at the moment. And I felt that the conclusion to her most recent book with her husband Stephen Rose in many ways seemed to say that we kind of lost that chance and that science has been taken over, particularly by forms of neoliberalism, to such an extent that those kind of political connections are kind of lost now. I'm not sure whether they are entirely. I just think they're different. But it'll be interesting to see what Professor Rose comes up with in terms of her more sort of detailed study of that and looking back, and what people make of it as a response as well, whether they're the people who were kind of inspired by my blog post, maybe there'll be more and more when she's written her book and they'll rise again. I don't know. Maybe different. Maybe it's really different in Canada. I mean, you've got people protesting on the streets in Canada, haven't you?
We do.
I think they're quite different, and we have similar movements. I think they're much more about standing up to science, whereas the radical science movement, what made them different from those groups is that they were about looking within science and saying maybe we should change too. And that it's a slightly different orientation. And I probably feel more comfortable with that latter one, whether it's left or right. Because that's another thing. Maybe these things don't have to be associated with either left or right. That question of whether they're about possibly changing science and seeing the systems in which we do science as a problem, rather than just how we push science out into the world as a problem, and that the world doesn't understand us, or maybe we don't understand ourselves properly enough. That question might be the difference that's most important, rather than left or right. And maybe that one, I'd love to see a world where the scientific community was self-reflective enough, or the public got involved and took, occupy science a bit, maybe. Maybe we need not a radical science movement, because that's not one that came out of the New Left and the social movements of the 70s, but an Occupy science movement, a movement that comes out of a very different set of political systems and ways of organising and is much more sort of web orientated. I don't think just having one repeat it. Another thing that's beautiful about looking back at the people in the 70s is they could see their history in the 30s, the Burnell stuff, and that they saw that they were different. And they said that, these people are part of our history and we love them and respect them, but equally they were wrong and these things are different and we're going to change. I think if we're going to have another movement today, then they should look to the people in the 70s and think about how our life now is different, how science is different, how politics and mediation are different, and also what they did that was wrong and how they can be better and to make something new.
I'm intrigued by your ideas, and I would like to subscribe to your newsletter.
Yeah, well, if we need to maybe not a newsletter though. You see, this is maybe the 70s style.
Well,
or
this
maybe
is the thing. Have we made it so that blogs have taken the place of things like newsletters and zines and such?
Yeah, well, I think there still is a they're not that different also, actually. A lot of the ways of... I was reading the letters pages in the magazines, very similar to blog comments. They just took a bit longer before they got published, and people probably took a bit longer to think about them before they wrote them, but they're pretty similar.
I, for one, would love to see a third wave of radical science. And Alice, thank you so much for covering this.
Okay, well, thanks for asking, and I look forward to seeing how any of these things might develop on the other side of the Atlantic.
You can find Alice Bell and a link to her Guardian piece, Beneath the White Coat, the Radical Science Movement, on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You're listening to Science for the People, and we'll be back to talk to Scicurious about GirlGeekCon after these messages.
On the next episode of Science for the People, we're exploring the technological, environmental, and economic challenges of feeding the human race. Desiree Schell spends the hour with Valentine Cadieux, professor of sociology and geology at the University of Minnesota, and graduate researcher Emily Cassidy. They'll discuss the sustainability of current global food production and look forward to how those systems can adapt to keep up with an expanding human population. That's next week on Science for the People, on your local radio station, or online at scienceforthepeople.ca.
And one more thing we wanted to mention today on Science for the People, and for that we're joined by Bethany Brookshire. Bethany is also known as Scicurious, and she blogs at Scientific American, at the Scicurious Brain, and at Scientopia at Neurotic Physiology. Hello, Sci.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
No problem. I like what you're doing. So, and speaking of, well, that's what you're here to talk about, what you're doing. Let's talk about GirlGeekCon. What is it, first of all?
GirlGeekCon is this completely fabulous conference that is aimed toward women who are geeks. Geeks in various ways. You know, they can be into fantasy, they can be into sci-fi, they can be into TV in general, games, all sorts of fun stuff. But it's a conference that, unlike a lot of the other bigger conferences like Dragon Con, stuff like that, is specifically geared toward women in geekdom. So it's a really fabulous conference. I've actually never attended. It'll be my first time.
I went last year, and it was brilliant. I had a ton of fun, and unfortunately I have something else to do that weekend this year, or else I would be there again. So I'm, start jealous, first of all. But a bunch of you got together, and you are going to be doing a DIY science zone. So what is that about?
Oh, it's totally awesome. I have to say, first off, that this is the mastermind behind this is actually Dr. Rubidium. So on Twitter, she's Dr. Rubidium, and I highly recommend her. She's a chemist, and she came up with the idea of taking science to something like a con, something where there's going to be people who are naturally geeky, naturally nerdy, interested in things like fantasy, sci-fi, but maybe not particularly interested in science. Maybe they're just interested in fantasy. Maybe they're just, magic people. Maybe they're just interested in that sort of thing and not really interested in science. A lot of them are kids, and they're kids who are still developing their interests. And this means that we can use something like GirlGeekCon to get them interested in science. And so a bunch of us are getting together, and we have gotten a table, a whole area actually, for a do-it-yourself science zone at GirlGeekCon, where we will get to show off our scienciness and help people do fun science activities for themselves. It's going to be an awesome, awesome time.
Well, give me an example, or actually give me a bunch of examples, because I read your post on this, and I really would like to be there. What kinds of things are you guys planning to do?
Oh, it's totally great. So we're going to do things like, did you know, for example, that you can make fossils out of coffee grounds? Because you can, and we're going to do that. We're going to do the acid-base chemistry of the body using the magic breath test, genetic taste tests to look at like bitter taste, DNA extraction of your own DNA, building things like slime, nature notebooks, and we're also going to be building neurons out of pipe cleaners, and you can take your own home to learn more about the neurons. So basically it's all sorts of different aspects of science, different scientific fields coming together and showing the people at GirlGeekCon that science is fun, science is interesting, and with all the people we've got going, that scientists look like anything they can imagine.
What do you need from our audience?
We need your money. And we're willing to do completely embarrassing acts of whimsy to make it worth your while. Basically, nobody funds the Do-It-Yourself Science Zone. This is just an idea that we've had to bring science to the people, and we would love to do it. But a lot of us are grad students, postdocs, poverty-stricken writers, various things. And so we really need money for travel, registration, and for supplies to make sure that we have enough stuff to allow tons and tons of people to do the fun science. So we need about a total of $5,000 to $6,000. And the good news is we are over halfway there. So we really don't need that much. We just need some.
Now, okay, so really the part that I am most interested in is these acts of whimsy, because you've written about them and they are something. They are something.
They are happening, yes. So we want to raise money to do science so bad that we are willing to do completely humiliating acts of whimsy. Truly humiliating. Oh, truly. I mean, we're starting low. We're starting with Matthew Francis wearing a Cthulhu hat in public, and that is nothing. That is only for $100. For example, for every $500 raised, Dr. Rubidium, who hates Nickelback like no other thing on this planet, will listen to a Nickelback album in public on a Google Hangout, which will go on YouTube. So you can pay to watch her suffer horribly. If we reach, for example, $500, the Twitter awesome @lolsocks will knit the donor a set of personalized zombie dolls. Which, I mean, awesome, right? If we hit $2,000, Celix will dress up her cat as every single one of the Avengers. And if you know Celix, you will know that her amazing abilities of costuming she's a fantastic costumer.
They are legendary, absolutely legendary.
Yes. So her cat will be dressed up not only as each of the Avengers, as a completely accurate and canon Avenger. The Catvenger. If we raise $2,500, Danielle Lee will reenact Samuel L. Jackson's demise in Deep Blue Sea for your viewing pleasure. We will do a reenactment of Prometheus with sock puppets for $3,000. We've called it Sockmetheus.
And wait, now what are you doing here? Because you don't seem to want to bring that up.
Well, no, I was just getting there. If we raise $1,500, and we already have, so it is in progress, but you could make it better. I will be doing my own version of a science pop song. So for the people who give us money, I will be listening to Miley Cyrus, or I don't know, somebody else who's really popular right now. And I will make up a science pop song based on it. So, call me maybe, fund me maybe.
Oh, I see where you're going there.
It could happen. And Matt Francis and I will perform it at GirlGeekCon. There might be choreography.
We are going to include a link to this post so that everybody can really get the sense of what you're trying to do and how much you're willing to do to get this table funded. And I very much appreciate that, because some of these are awful, and I don't know if I actually want them to happen.
Actually, so if you really do worry for Dr. Rubidium's safety in listening to Nickelback albums, there's actually a separate fund where you can elect to donate to GirlGeekCon and save her from Nickelback.
That's sharp.
Very nice. You can also save her if you feel deep pity. I don't, but if you do.
So again, there is acts of whimsy aside, this is something that's really, really valuable. This is a great audience to do science communication to.
Yes, we're really, really looking forward to it. And the more funding we have, the more of us can make it there and make science awesome for some people who may just need a little bit of science experience to become scientists themselves.
Okay, everyone, go donate. This is a very worthwhile cause. And so do check our website, and a link will take you directly there. I wish you all the best of luck, and I'm sure you will have a marvelous time.
Thanks so much, and make sure to check out, if we raise the final amount, we will dance a jig. Group choreography. You want to see it.
And that's it for us. We would love you to take a moment and visit our new website at scienceforthepeople.ca and click all the links. There are absolutely tons of new features, and we hope that you like it as much as we do. And make sure to check out our new Science for the People mugs that we're offering, complete with our iconic new logo. They're perfect for you or the radical science types in your life. Thanks for listening to the very first episode of Science for the People. There's much, much more to come. See you next week. Science for the People is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta. The show is produced by Rachelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our promotions manager. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. K.O. Myers updates our website. Helen Quavillion is our publishing liaison. Ed Haynes is our guest coordinator. We get research help from Josh Witten. The show is edited by K.O. Myers and Ryan Bromsgrove. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. The show is hosted by Rachelle Saunders, Marie Claire Shanahan, and me, Desiree Schell.